Come on. Everyone knows this marriage is just for show. Touch my wife again, and I will end you.
What happens when a billionaire who's sworn off love meets the one woman who could destroy everything he's built to protect himself? Have you ever made a deal that seemed simple on the surface, only to discover it would change everything about who you thought you were? Have you ever tried to protect your heart so fiercely that you ended up walking straight into the very thing you were trying to avoid? Tonight's story is about two people who thought they could fake love without consequences, who believed they could share a name, a home, even a life, while keeping their hearts completely separate. They were both wrong. But what happens when the lines between performance and reality blur so completely that you can't tell where the act ends and the truth begins? What happens when protecting yourself becomes the very thing that destroys you? Welcome to Mr. Roman's Story Vault, where every story carries a lesson that could change your life. If you're new here, I'm Mr. Roman, and I believe the most powerful truths come wrapped in the most compelling stories. Before we explore tonight's incredible journey, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what unfolds in this tale of pride, passion, and the price of true love. This is the story of Kendall Mercer and Thatcher Calloway. She was a woman who learned early that dignity was free, even when everything else came at a cost. He was a man who built walls so high around his heart that he forgot there might be something worth protecting inside. When desperation forced her into his world, and loneliness made him vulnerable to her strength, they struck a bargain that should have been simple. A contract marriage, no feelings, no complications, no forever, just business. But some forces are stronger than contracts. Some connections refuse to be contained by logic or fear, or the careful boundaries we set to keep ourselves safe. Tonight, you'll witness a transformation that neither of them saw coming. You'll watch as two people who thought they had everything figured out discover that the heart has its own plans that don't care about prenuptial agreements or emotional walls, or all the very good reasons why falling in love would be a terrible mistake. This is more than a love story. It's a story about courage, the courage to risk everything for something real, the courage to choose vulnerability over safety, the courage to believe that some things are worth breaking your own rules for. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about love, contracts, and the dangerous space where pretending becomes the most honest thing you've ever done. The question isn't whether they'll fall in love. The question is whether they'll survive it. Let's find out together. Kendall Mercer's earliest memory wasn't of birthday parties or Christmas mornings. It was of standing in the grocery store checkout line with her grandmother, watching the older woman count and recount crumpled bills while the cashier waited with barely concealed impatience. "Grandmama," 6-year-old Kendall had whispered, tugging at her grandmother's worn coat. "I don't need the cereal." Her grandmother, Beatrice Mercer, had looked down at her with eyes that held decades of struggle but never defeat. She placed a gentle hand on Kendall's head and said something that would shape every decision the young girl would make for the rest of her life. "Baby girl, there's a difference between pride and dignity. Pride makes you think you're too good for help. Dignity makes you know you're worth fighting for. We might not have money, but we'll never be without dignity. Remember that." Beatrice had bought the cereal that day, even though it meant walking home instead of taking the bus. Years later, Kendall would understand that her grandmother was teaching her the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes love requires sacrifice, but it should never require surrendering who you are. 22 years later, Kendall stood in her tiny apartment bathroom, staring at her reflection while those words echoed in her mind. Her grandmother had been gone for 3 years, but her voice remained as clear as ever. Tonight, Kendall needed that voice more than she needed air. The medical bills spread across her kitchen table told a story she couldn't rewrite. Micah, her younger brother, and the only family she had left, needed surgery. That would cost more than she could earn in a decade of teaching. The tumor pressing against his spinal cord wasn't waiting for her financial situation to improve. Every day they delayed treatment was another day closer to permanent paralysis. She had tried everything. Bank loans she couldn't qualify for. Crowdfunding campaigns that barely raised a few $100s. She had even swallowed her pride and reached out to distant relatives, who made it clear that her family's problems weren't their concern. That's when she learned about Thatcher Calloway. The billionaire CEO of Calloway Industries was known for his business acumen and his complete lack of interest in charity cases. But Kindle had read about his mother's foundation, had seen the carefully worded mission statements about helping families in crisis. She had spent 3 months crafting letters to his assistant, each one more desperate than the last, each one ignored. But desperation has a way of making the impossible feel necessary. Kindle had used her last $100 to buy the blazer she wore as she walked through the marble lobby of Calloway Industries. The shoes pinched her feet because they belonged to her neighbor, a woman 2 sizes smaller who'd taken pity on Kindle's situation. The elevator climbed 42 floors, each one taking her further from the world she knew and closer to a realm where decisions were measured in millions rather than months of grocery money. When the doors opened to reveal Thatcher Calloway's executive floor, Kindle felt the full weight of what she was attempting. "Mr. Calloway doesn't see people without appointments," the receptionist said, barely glancing up from her computer. "Then I'll wait until he does," Kindle replied, settling into one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than her monthly rent. 4 hours later, the receptionist's polite professionalism had turned to grudging respect. When Thatcher Calloway finally emerged from his office at 8 in the evening, he found Kindle exactly where she'd been all day, reading a book she'd brought from her classroom. "You're persistent," he said, studying her with eyes the color of storm clouds. "I'll give you that." Kindle closed her book and stood, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Calloway, I need 5 minutes of your time." Something in her tone made him pause. Maybe it was the way she asked without begging. Maybe it was the quiet strength in her voice that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. Whatever it was, he surprised himself by nodding toward his office. 5 minutes, he said. Thatcher Calloway's office was a study in controlled power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that sprawled below like a kingdom he ruled from his glass tower. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, chosen for its aesthetic value rather than comfort. Everything about the space screamed success, but nothing whispered home. "You're the woman who's been sending letters to my assistant for 3 months, he said, settling behind his desk without inviting her to sit. "You're the man who's been ignoring them," Kindle replied, taking the chair across from him anyway. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Thatcher Calloway was genuinely surprised. People didn't speak to him like that. They deferred, they flattered, they approached him with the careful reverence, reserved for someone who could change their lives with a single phone call. This woman, in her borrowed blazer and determined expression, was treating him like an equal. "My brother has a spinal tumor," Kindle continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The surgery costs $375,000. I'm a teacher. I make $32,000 a year. The math doesn't work." She leaned forward, and Thatcher caught a scent that was completely at odds with his. Sterile office environment, something warm and real, like vanilla and clean laundry. "I'm not here to ask for charity. I'm here to propose a trade." Thatcher's eyebrows raised slightly. In his world, everyone wanted something for nothing. The idea of someone offering a trade was intriguing enough to keep him listening. "I have time," Kindle said. "I have complete availability, the ability to travel, and I'm educated. Enough to handle myself in any social situation you might require. I also have something most people in your world don't, which is nothing to lose," she said simply. "Which means I'll tell you the truth even when you don't want to hear it." Thatcher leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. He'd built his empire on reading people, on understanding what motivated them and how to use those motivations to his advantage. But this woman was presenting herself as a puzzle he couldn't immediately solve. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Mercer?" Kindle took a deep breath, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would change everything. "Marriage." The silence in the room was complete. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm, but inside the glass tower, time seemed suspended. I beg your pardon. Thatcher's voice was carefully controlled. A business arrangement, Kindle clarified, her cheeks warming but her voice remaining steady. I know about your mother's condition. I know she's been pressuring you to settle down. I also know that every woman in your social circle has been trying to land you for years, and you've made it clear you're not interested. She clasped her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. I propose a temporary marriage. 6 months, maybe a year, long enough to satisfy your mother's concerns, short enough to end cleanly. You pay for my brother's surgery, and I play the perfect wife for however long you need me to. Thatcher was quiet for so long that Kindle wondered if she'd broken him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. My mother is dying, he said quietly. The doctors give her 3 months, maybe 6 if the treatments work. She wants to see me married before she goes. She wants to believe I'm capable of loving someone more than I love my work. He stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghostly against the darkening sky. She's wrong, of course. Love is a luxury I can't afford. It makes people weak, vulnerable. It ruins judgment and destroys empires. Kindle watched him, seeing something in his posture that made her heart ache. This wasn't the cold businessman the tabloids wrote about. This was a son trying to give his dying mother peace. But you want to try, she said softly. For her, he turned back to face her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, that she understood without him having to explain. Why you? He asked. I could hire an actress. I could find someone from my own social circle who'd jump at the chance. Because an actress would want to extend the performance. Someone from your world would want to make it real. Kindle stood, walking closer to his desk. I have no interest in your money beyond what I need to save my brother. I have no interest in your lifestyle or your social status. When the time comes to walk away, I will, and you'll never see me again. Thatcher studied her face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What he found instead was something he'd never encountered before. Complete honesty without expectation. 1 year, he said finally. Not 6 months. If we're going to convince anyone, it needs to be believable. You'll sign a prenuptial agreement that ensures you leave with nothing but the medical bills paid. You'll have your own room, your own space. But you'll attend every event I require and play the part convincingly. Kindle's heart was racing, but her voice remained calm. And you? What are your obligations in this arrangement? To treat you with respect, to ensure your safety and comfort, and to make sure my mother believes we're genuinely in love. They stared at each other across the expanse of his office, 2 people from completely different worlds about to bind their lives together for all the wrong reasons, or all the right ones, depending on how you looked at it. Do we have a deal, Miss Mercer? Thatcher extended his hand. Kindle looked at his outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would change everything. She thought about Micah, lying in a hospital bed while they ran tests they couldn't afford. She thought about her grandmother's words about dignity and fighting for what was worth saving. We have a deal, Mr. Calloway, she said, placing her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, something electric passed between them, a jolt of awareness that neither had expected. Thatcher's grip lingered a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and Kindle felt her breath catch. They pulled apart quickly, both pretending the moment hadn't happened. But it had, and somewhere in the back of both their minds, a small voice wondered if they'd just made the best decision of their lives, or the most dangerous one. But before we see how this arrangement unfolds, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between your pride and someone you love? Let me know below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story is already pulling at your heartstrings. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in the gardens of the Calloway estate. 27 days after Kindle had shaken Thatcher's hand in his office. 27 days in which lawyers had drafted agreements, backgrounds had been checked, and Micah had been scheduled for the surgery that would save his mobility. Kindle's brother had asked only one question when she told him about the marriage. Do you know what you're doing? She had lied and said yes. Now, standing in a dressing room that was larger than her entire apartment, wearing a cream-colored dress that cost more than 6 months of her salary. Kindle wondered if she'd ever known what she was doing in her entire life. "You look beautiful, dear," came a soft voice from the doorway. Genevieve Calloway moved slowly, her body ravaged by the illness that was stealing her one breath at a time. But her eyes, the same grey as her son's, held a sharpness that illness couldn't touch. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway," Kindle said, fighting the urge to confess that everything was a lie. "Call me Genevieve, please. We're family now." The older woman settled into a chair, her movements careful and measured. "Come, sit with me for a moment." Kindle obeyed, perching on the ottoman across from her soon-to-be mother-in-law. "My son is not an easy man to love," Genevieve said, her directness catching Kindle off guard. "His father taught him that emotions were weaknesses to be exploited. I tried to counter that teaching, but a mother's influence only goes so far when a boy watches his father destroy everything he touches." She reached out and took Kindle's hand. Her grip was weak, but her intent was fierce. "But I see the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. There's something there. Fear, maybe, but also hope. That's more than I've seen in his eyes in 20 years. Guilt twisted in Kindle's stomach. This woman was dying, and Kindle was helping her son deceive her. But before she could speak, Genevieve squeezed her hand. "Whatever brought you two together, whatever arrangement you think you've made, I want you to know this. Love has a way of making liars of us all. We tell ourselves we won't fall, we won't feel, we won't need. And love laughs at our certainty and changes us anyway." 15 minutes later, Kindle walked down a stone path lined with white roses. There were only 12 guests: Genevieve, Micah in his wheelchair, a handful of business associates. Thatcher needed to convince, and his personal assistant who served as best man. Thatcher stood at the end of the path in a charcoal suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine. When Kindle met his eyes, she saw something that made her steps falter. He looked genuinely nervous. The ceremony was brief. They exchanged vows they didn't mean, and rings that felt heavier than gold should feel. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Thatcher hesitated for just a moment before leaning in. It was meant to be quick, perfunctory, just for show. But the moment his lips touched hers, something shifted. The kiss was soft, almost questioning, and it lasted exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary. When they pulled apart, Thatcher's eyes searched hers with an expression she couldn't read. Then he turned to face their small audience, his mask of cool composure sliding back into place. Only Kindle felt his hand trembling slightly where it held hers. Genevieve cried through the entire reception. "My boy," she kept saying, pressing her hand to Thatcher's cheek. "My beautiful boy," finally letting someone in. That night, when they arrived at Thatcher's penthouse as husband and wife, the weight of what they'd done settled over them both. "Your room is down the hall, second door on the left," Thatcher said, his tone carefully neutral. "I've had your things moved from your apartment. If you need anything adjusted, let Marcus know." Marcus was his house manager, a man who appeared and disappeared like a well-dressed ghost. "The closet has been stocked with appropriate clothing for the events we'll attend. You'll find a credit card in the top drawer of the dresser. Use it for whatever you need." "I don't need your money," Kindle said quietly. "It's not my money. It's my wife's money." "There's a difference." The word wife hung between them, strange and foreign. "We should establish some ground rules," Thatcher continued, his hands sliding into his pockets. "Public events require physical contact, hand-holding, dancing, the occasional kiss. But here, in private, we maintain separate lives. You have complete freedom during the day. I only ask that you're available for evening functions when required. And if I have plans, do you have plans?" His eyebrow raised slightly. "No," Kindle admitted. "But I might." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Then we'll coordinate schedules like civilized people." He turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you for today. My mother was happy. That's worth more than you know." Kindle stood alone in the hallway of her new home, listening to his footsteps fade away, and wondered how something that was supposed to be simple had already become so complicated. The first month passed in a blur of carefully choreographed performances. There was the charity gala, where Thatcher's hand rested on the small of her back all evening, his touch burning through the fabric of her dress. There was the business dinner, where she charmed his most difficult client simply by asking about the man's grandchildren. There was the art gallery opening, where Thatcher quietly bid on a painting Kindle had admired, then acted like it was coincidence when it was delivered to the penthouse the next day. "You didn't have to do that," she said, standing in front of the abstract piece. That somehow captured exactly how she felt, caught between structure and chaos. "I didn't," he replied, not looking up from his laptop. "The penthouse needed art. You have taste. It was efficient." But Kindle noticed he'd hung it where she could see it from the breakfast table. She began to observe things about him that the tabloids never mentioned. He drank his coffee black, but kept cream in the refrigerator after she moved in. He worked until 2 in the morning most nights, but always checked to see if her light was still on before he went to bed. He was ruthless in business meetings, but never once raised his voice to his staff. He remembered that she didn't like champagne and always ensured there was wine at events. He noticed when she was cold and would drape his jacket over her shoulders without breaking conversation. He listened when she talked about her students with an attention that suggested he actually cared. "You miss teaching," he observed one evening as they rode home from a fundraiser. "I do," Kindle admitted. "I know I'm doing important work here, helping with your mother's foundation, but there's something about watching a child's face when they finally understand a concept they've been struggling with. That moment of clarity, nothing else quite matches it. So, go back," Thatcher said simply. "What?" "Go back. Teach. This arrangement doesn't require you to give up who you are." Kindle stared at him, surprised. "You wouldn't mind?" He met her gaze, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "I mind a lot of things, Kindle. You being happy isn't one of them." It was the first time he'd called her by her first name. The shift happened on a Wednesday evening in late October. Kindle had been visiting Micah at the rehabilitation center, thrilled by his progress and lost in conversation about his plans to return to finish college. She hadn't noticed the storm rolling in until she stepped outside and the sky opened up. By the time she reached the penthouse, she was soaked through. Her dress clung to her body like a second skin, her hair dripping water across the marble floor, her teeth chattering from cold. Thatcher was home early, a rarity. He stood in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, mid-conversation with someone in Tokyo. But the moment he saw her, every word died in his throat. She watched his eyes travel down her body, watched his jaw clench, watched his grip tighten on the phone until his knuckles went white. The air between them became charged with something that had been building for weeks but had never been acknowledged. "I'll call you back," he said roughly, ending the call without waiting for a response. The silence was absolute. Kindle stood frozen, water pooling at her feet, unable to move under the intensity of his stare. "You should change," Thatcher said, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it. "You'll catch cold." "I was about to," she managed to say, but her feet wouldn't cooperate. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he might touch her. Instead, he grabbed a throw blanket from the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands careful not to make contact with her skin. But she felt the heat of him anyway, felt the way his breath quickened, felt the tremendous effort it took for him to step back. "Go," he said, and it sounded like a plea. "Please." Kindle went, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. That night, she heard sounds from the gym at 2 in the morning. The rhythmic impact of fists hitting the punching bag echoed through the penthouse like a heartbeat. She stood in her doorway, listening, understanding that she wasn't the only one fighting an internal war. After that night, everything became harder. She became hyper-aware of every moment they touched. The way he helped her out of cars, his hand lingering on hers for just a fraction too long. The way they danced at events, his hand on her waist, her hand on his shoulder, there. Bodies moving together like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, and when she looked back, he didn't always turn away. They began talking late at night, sitting in the living room with the city lights spread before them. He told her about building his company from the ground up after his father nearly destroyed it, about the pressure of being responsible for thousands of employees and their families, about the loneliness that came with success. She told him about her grandmother's death, about raising Micah while working 2 jobs and putting herself through college, about the constant fear that she wasn't enough, wasn't doing enough, wasn't being enough. "You're more than enough," he said quietly one night. And the way he looked at her made her believe it. One evening, as they prepared for yet another gala, Kindle struggled with the clasp of her necklace. Thatcher appeared behind her, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck as he fastened it. "There," he murmured, but he didn't step away. In the mirror, their eyes met. His hands rested lightly on her shoulders, and she could feel the warmth of his body behind hers. They stayed like that for a long moment, suspended in something neither wanted to name. "We should go," Kindle whispered. "We'll be late." "Yes," Thatcher agreed, but still didn't move. "We should." When he finally stepped back, the loss of his warmth felt like bereavement. At the gala, a business associate's wife commented on how in love they seemed. "You can't fake that kind of chemistry," she said with a knowing smile. Kindle and Thatcher exchanged glances, and neither could honestly say she was wrong. The truth was becoming unavoidable. What had started as a business arrangement was transforming into something far more dangerous. Every shared glance held meaning. Every accidental touch sent electricity through them both. Every conversation revealed new layers, new vulnerabilities, new reasons why keeping their distance was becoming impossible. Thatcher found himself rushing home from meetings, making excuses to leave events early, just to have more time near her. He memorized the way she took her coffee, the books she read, the small sounds she made when she was thinking deeply about something. Kindle caught herself choosing dresses she knew he'd like, staying up late in hopes. He'd come home early, listening for his footsteps in the hallway outside her room. They were both lying to themselves about what was happening. But lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually crumble under the weight of truth. The chemistry between them is undeniable, but they're both fighting it. Drop a heart emoji in the comments if you think they should stop fighting their feelings. And make sure you're subscribed because this tension is about to reach a breaking point. Thatcher Calloway hadn't slept properly in 6 weeks. Every night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing she was just down the hall. Close enough to reach in 30 steps. Close enough that he could sometimes hear the soft sound of her moving around her room, the quiet click of her lamp turning off, the rustle of sheets as she settled in for the night. He had built his entire adult life on control. Control over his emotions, his business, his desires. He had watched his father, charming, weak-willed Richard Calloway, destroy their family one affair at a time. He'd seen his mother's quiet devastation as she pretended not to notice the lipstick stains and perfume that wasn't hers. He'd learned that desire made men stupid, and love made them vulnerable. So he had decided early that he would be neither stupid nor vulnerable. For 15 years, that strategy had worked perfectly. He'd built an empire, earned respect, and never once let anyone close enough to matter. Then Kindle Mercer had walked into his office in borrowed shoes, and every wall he'd ever built started developing cracks. Now those cracks were becoming chasms. He dreamed of her. Not the polite, distant dreams of casual attraction, but vivid, consuming dreams. That left him waking in the dark, his heart racing and his body aching. Dreams where she smiled at him the way she smiled at her brother, with complete trust and unreserved affection. Dreams where he had the right to touch her, to hold her, to keep her. Dreams that felt more real than his waking life. It was getting worse. Yesterday, he'd cancelled a meeting with the board because he'd looked at his calendar and realized it would make him late for dinner with Kindle. Last week, he'd caught himself buying flowers for the penthouse, something he'd never done in his life, simply because he'd overheard her mention loving peonies. He was losing control, and it terrified him. "You look like hell," his assistant observed one morning, setting coffee on his desk. "Thank you for that assessment," Thatcher replied dryly. "When's the last time you slept?" Thatcher didn't answer. The last time he'd slept well was before Kindle had appeared in his life, and admitting that felt too much like admitting defeat. His father had been weak. His father had let desire rule his decisions, had destroyed his marriage and damaged his son for temporary pleasure. Thatcher had sworn he would be different, stronger, better. But every time Kindle looked at him with those warm brown eyes, every time she laughed at something, he said, every time she touched his arm and asked if he was okay, he felt his resolve weakening. He was starting to understand how his father had fallen. Not because desire was irresistible, but because the right person could make you want to fall. And Kindle was absolutely the right person, which made her the most dangerous woman he'd ever met. Genevieve's birthday celebration was planned for the third Saturday in November. Despite her declining health, she insisted on gathering the family, or what remained of it. "It might be my last birthday," she said, when Thatcher suggested a quiet dinner instead. "Let me see everyone together one more time." So Thatcher arranged everything. The ballroom at the family estate, catering from her favorite restaurant, flowers everywhere, because his mother had always loved flowers. And he prepared himself to parade Kindle in front of the extended Calloway family, each member more judgmental than the last. "They're going to hate me," Kindle said the morning of the party, staring at her closet with mild panic. "They hate everyone," Thatcher replied, leaning against her doorframe. "It's not personal." She turned to look at him, and he was struck again by how beautiful she was. Not magazine cover beautiful, but real, alive, present in a way that made everything around her seem faded by comparison. "Your cousin Margot called me the charity case to a reporter last week," Kindle pointed out. "Margot is bitter because her third husband just left her. Ignore her. Easy for you to say. You're a Calloway. I'm just—" "My wife," Thatcher interrupted, pushing off the doorframe and walking toward her. "You're my wife, Kindle. And if anyone in my family forgets that, I'll remind them." The intensity in his voice surprised them both. That evening, Kindle wore a deep emerald dress that made her skin glow. Thatcher had to physically stop himself from staring when she emerged from her room. "Will this work?" she asked, smoothing the fabric nervously. "You look perfect," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in his life. The party was exactly as tedious as he'd expected. Aunts who'd never called except when they needed money. Cousins who smiled to his face and plotted against him in boardrooms. Business associates who pretended friendship while waiting for him to show weakness. But Genevieve was radiant. Despite her frailty, she moved through the room greeting guests, her hand, often reaching for Thatcher's arm or Kindle's hand, drawing them close. "You've made him human again," she whispered to Kindle during a quiet moment. "I didn't think anyone could." Kindle's throat tightened with guilt, but before she could respond, Genevieve squeezed her hand. "Don't look so worried, dear. Just love him. That's all he needs. If only it were that simple." The trouble started an hour into the party. Fletcher Calloway, distant cousin, failed entrepreneur, and perpetual embarrassment to the family name, had been drinking steadily since arriving. He'd been watching Kindle all evening, his gaze lingering in ways that made Thatcher's jaw clench. When Kindle excused herself to the restroom, Fletcher followed. He intercepted her in the hallway, positioning himself between her and the ballroom. Up close, she could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the glassy quality of his eyes. "You know, Kindle," he said, standing too close, "Thatcher always did have excellent taste in acquisitions." "Excuse me," she said coolly, trying to step around him. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Don't be unfriendly. We're family now, aren't we? Let go of me. Come on. Everyone knows this marriage is just for show. Thatcher doesn't have it in him to actually love someone." His other hand reached for her waist, pulling her closer. "When you get tired of my cousin's cold shoulder, I'd be more than happy to warm you up." "I said let go. Is there a problem here?" Thatcher's voice cut through the hallway like a blade. Fletcher released Kindle immediately, but the damage was done. Thatcher had seen his cousin's hands on his wife, had heard the proposition, had watched Kindle's discomfort. Something in him that had been barely contained for months finally broke free. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He simply crossed the distance between them in 3 measured steps, took Kindle's hand, and looked at Fletcher with an expression that could freeze blood. "Touch my wife again," Thatcher said quietly, each word precise and deadly, "and I will end you. Not your career, not your reputation. You. Do we understand each other?" Fletcher's face went pale. He'd never seen his cousin look at anyone like that, with a rage so controlled it was more terrifying than any explosion. "You were just leaving," Thatcher interrupted. "Now." Fletcher fled. Thatcher turned to Kindle, his hand still holding hers, his grip almost tight enough to hurt. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. He was drunk and stupid, but I could have handled—" "I know you could have." His voice was rough, strained. "That's not the point." He was still holding her hand. His thumb traced circles on her wrist, a gesture that would have seemed tender if not for the tension radiating from his body. "Come with me," he said, and led her through the French doors into the garden. The November air was cold, but Kindle barely felt it. Thatcher still hadn't released her hand, and the warmth of his touch seemed to spread through her entire body. They walked in silence until they reached the far edge of the garden, away from the lights and music and watching eyes. "I'm sorry," Kindle said finally. "I didn't encourage him. I wouldn't—" "Stop." Thatcher turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes stole her breath. "I know you didn't. I know exactly who you are, Kindle. That's the problem." "What do you mean?" He released her hand, but only to run his own hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd never seen from him before. "I mean that this arrangement was supposed to be simple, clean, transactional. You play the part, I pay for your brother's care. We both walk away unscathed." His eyes met hers in the darkness, and she could see him struggling with something. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped being a transaction. You became the person I think about when I wake up, the person I rush home to see, the person whose happiness matters more to me than my own." Kindle's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Thatcher, I'm not a good man, Kindle." His voice was raw now, all pretense stripped away. "I've spent my entire life making sure I never needed anyone, never depended on anyone, never gave anyone the power to hurt me." He stepped closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You walk around my house like you belong there. You smile at me like I'm worth something. You argue with me like you're not afraid of me. And every single day you make it harder for me to remember why I'm supposed to keep my distance." "Why are you saying this now?" Kindle whispered. "Because I watched another man touch you tonight, and I wanted to destroy him. Because I can't sleep knowing you're 30 steps away from me. Because I'm losing control, and I've never lost control of anything in my life." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, with a tenderness that contradicted everything he claimed to be. "I will ruin you for other men," he said, his voice a low promise that sent shivers down her spine. "If I let myself have you, if I give in to this, I will spend every day making sure no one else ever compares. I will learn every inch of you. I will memorize every sound you make. And when this arrangement ends, you'll spend the rest of your life searching for something you'll only find with me." Kindle's breath caught. "That sounds like a threat." "It's a warning." His forehead dropped to hers, and she could feel his breath on her lips. "Walk away from me, Kindle. Tell me to keep my distance, because if you don't, I won't be able to stop myself anymore." She should have been afraid, should have reminded him of their contract, their boundaries, the temporary nature of everything between them. Instead, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat he froze, then something in him unleashed. He kissed her like a man who'd been starving and she was sustenance, like a man who'd been drowning and she was air. His hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her against him, eliminating every millimeter of space between them. Kindle had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with this kind of intensity, this complete and utter focus. Thatcher kissed her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, like he was memorizing the taste of her, the feel of her, the sound of the small gasp she made when his teeth grazed her bottom lip. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing heavily, he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Wonder, fear, hope, all tangled together in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "There's no going back from this," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know." Kindle's hands were fisted in his shirt, keeping him close. "I don't want to go back." He kissed her again, softer this time but no less consuming. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "This changes everything," he whispered. "Yes," she agreed. "It does." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, acknowledging that the careful walls they'd built had just come crashing down. When they finally returned to the party, hand in hand, Genevieve took one look at them and smiled. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She could see it in the way her son held his wife's hand, in the way Kindle looked at Thatcher when she thought no one was watching, in the way they moved together, drawn by a force neither could fight anymore. Love had found them despite their best efforts to avoid it, and watching them, Genevieve knew her son would be all right. Even after she was gone, he would have someone who saw past his defenses to the man beneath. That knowledge, more than anything else, gave her peace. The months following that kiss in the garden transformed everything. Thatcher stopped pretending he needed separate space. Most nights, he and Kindle fell asleep on the couch, talking until exhaustion claimed them. She would wake to find his jacket draped over her shoulders, and he would. Wake to find she'd left coffee brewing exactly the way he liked it. They learned each other in the way lovers do, through 1,000 small discoveries that added up to intimacy. Kindle learned that Thatcher had nightmares about his father, dreams where he became the same man he despised. She learned that he donated anonymously to 12 different charities, that he remembered every employee's name, that he kept a photograph of his mother as a young woman on his desk because it reminded him that she'd once been happy. Thatcher learned that Kindle sang to herself when she cooked, that she cried during commercials with dogs in them, that she called her brother every single day to make sure he was staying on track with physical therapy. He learned that she'd wanted to be a writer as a child, but gave up that dream. When her father died, and survival became more important than aspirations. "You could still write," he told her one evening, watching her scribble notes in a journal. "Maybe someday," she said, but her tone suggested someday meant never. The next week, a laptop appeared on her desk with writing software already installed. When she asked about it, Thatcher shrugged. "Someday is today," he said simply. "Write your stories, Kindle." They stopped sleeping in separate rooms after New Year's Eve. It happened naturally, without discussion or decision. They'd stayed up watching the ball drop, kissing at midnight like they had every right to. And when Kindle stood to go to her room, Thatcher caught her hand. "Stay," he said quietly. She stayed. That night, wrapped in his arms, listening to his heartbeat beneath her ear, Kindle realized she was completely, irrevocably in love with her husband, and the thought didn't scare her nearly as much as it should have. Genevieve noticed the change immediately. "You're glowing," she told Kindle during one of their Sunday visits. The older woman's health was declining rapidly, but her mind remained sharp. "It's just happiness," Kindle said, helping Genevieve settle into her favorite chair. "It's love," Genevieve corrected. "And it looks beautiful on you." She reached for Kindle's hand, her grip weak but insistent. "Take care of him when I'm gone. Not because he needs protecting, but because he'll forget he deserves happiness. Remind him, every day if you have to." Tears burned in Kindle's eyes. "I will. I promise." And, "Kindle?" Genevieve's eyes held hers. "Whatever storm comes, and a storm will come, it always does, don't run. He'll expect you to run. Everyone in his life has run. Be the one who stays." At the time, Kindle thought it was just a dying woman's general wisdom. She didn't know it was prophecy. Prescott Manning had built his career on destroying men like Thatcher Calloway. Where Thatcher had aimed his fortune through innovation and calculated risk, Manning had clawed his way to wealth through manipulation and exploitation. 3 years ago, Thatcher had outbid him on a tech acquisition that would have saved Manning's failing company. Manning lost everything: his business, his reputation, His marriage. He'd been waiting for an opportunity to return the favor ever since. When rumors of Thatcher's sudden marriage began circulating, Manning saw his chance. He hired investigators, dug through public records, and eventually found what he was looking for: a paper trail of payments from Callaway Industries to Kendall Mercer that predated their marriage by exactly 3 months. The same amount as her brother's surgery. Manning sat on the information for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when Thatcher announced a major merger that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the country. Manning released everything to the media on a Tuesday morning. Kendall woke to 73 missed calls. She reached for her phone groggily, confused by the notification overload. The first headline she saw made her blood run cold. Billionaire's marriage exposed as fraud. Contract wife paid $375,000 to play the part. Her hands shook as she scrolled through article after article, each one more invasive than the last. They'd found the original contract, or parts of it. They'd interviewed former colleagues who speculated about the arrangement. They'd photographed the timeline of payments and connected every damning dot. The media had turned their love story into a transaction. "Thatcher!" she called out, her voice breaking. He appeared in the doorway, already dressed, his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw her face, he ended the call without explanation. "You've seen it," he said flatly. "How did they—" Manning. His jaw clenched. "He's been investigating us for months." Kendall's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Micah. "Kendall, what the hell is going on? Is it true? Did you marry him for money?" The hurt in her brother's voice cut deeper than any headline. "Micah, I can explain. You lied to me. For months. I thought you'd found someone who made you happy." "I did. It started as an arrangement, but it became real. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" He hung up. Kendall stared at her phone, tears streaming down her face. Around her, the penthouse that had become home suddenly felt like a glass cage, with the entire world watching from outside. "I need to release a statement," Thatcher said, already typing on his phone. "Something about the contract being a misunderstanding. My lawyers—" "Look at me." He didn't. "Thatcher, look at me." When he finally raised his eyes to hers, what she saw made her heart crack. The warmth, the openness, the vulnerability he'd shown her for months, all of it was gone. In its place was the cold businessman she'd met in his office a lifetime ago. He was retreating. Right in front of her eyes, he was building his walls back up. "This will pass," he said mechanically. "Scandals always do. We just need to manage the narrative carefully. That's not what I'm worried about." "Then what?" "You," Kendall said, standing and walking toward him. "I'm worried about you." He stepped back, maintaining distance. "I'm fine. You're lying. I'm handling this the way I handle every crisis. Strategically, logically. We're not a crisis to handle, Thatcher. We're real. What we have is real." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain maybe, or fear, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Is it?" His voice was colder now. "Or did we just convince ourselves it was real because it was convenient, because it felt good to pretend?" The words hit her like a physical blow. "You don't mean that, don't I?" He turned away, staring out at the city. "We entered a business arrangement. We blurred the lines. Now we're paying the price for that lack of discipline." "Lack of discipline?" Kendall's voice rose. "Is that what you call what happened between us?" "I call it a mistake." The silence that followed was devastating. Kendall felt like she couldn't breathe. This was the man who'd kissed her like she was oxygen, who'd held her through nightmares and laughed at her terrible jokes and looked at her like she'd hung the moon. This was the man who'd promised to ruin her for others. He'd kept that promise, and now he was destroying her. "I don't believe you," she said quietly. "I don't believe you think this was a mistake. Believe what you want." His voice was devoid of emotion. "It doesn't change the reality of our situation, which is that I'm a Callaway. I've weathered worse scandals than this. But you'll be torn apart by the media. Your students' parents will question your judgment. Your brother already doubts you. The longer you stay connected to me, the worse it will get. Understanding dawned cold and terrible. You're pushing me away. I'm being practical. You're being a coward. That made him turn. Anger flashed across his face, the first real emotion she'd seen since the scandal broke. Excuse me? You heard me. Kindle walked toward him, refusing to let him retreat further. You told me once that everyone in your life has left. Your father chose other women. Your friends were opportunists. Everyone you trusted walked away. She stopped directly in front of him, forcing him to see her. You're so terrified that I'll leave that you're pushing me out first. That way you can tell yourself it was your choice, your control. But it's just fear, Thatcher. You're just scared. Of course I'm scared. The words exploded from him, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering. Look at what's happening. Look at what I've done to your life. He gripped her shoulders, not roughly but desperately. Your brother won't speak to you. Your colleagues are calling. Reporters are camped outside this building trying to get a statement. And it's all because of me, because I was selfish enough to want you when I knew I had nothing to offer. His voice cracked. I don't know how to do this, Kindle. I don't know how to be what you need. Everyone I've ever loved has left. My father destroyed my mother with his weaknesses. I swore I'd never need anyone, never depend on anyone, never give anyone the power to devastate me. Tears were forming in his eyes now, something she'd never seen before. But you have that power. You have all of it. And this scandal, this exposure, it's the excuse you need to leave, and I won't survive it. I won't survive watching you realize that loving me isn't worth the cost. The fear in his voice, the raw vulnerability, broke something open in Kindle's chest. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to maintain eye contact. Let me tell you something my grandmother used to say. Anyone can stay when it's easy. Love is staying when it's hard. She brushed away the tears on his cheeks with her thumbs. I didn't fall in love with your money or your name or this penthouse. I fell in love with the man who remembers how I take my coffee, who reads to his dying mother every Sunday even though it breaks his heart, who fights every day against the coldness he was taught and chooses warmth instead. Her own tears were falling freely now. Yes, this is hard. Yes, the media is brutal, and my brother is hurt, and the whole world is watching. But you know what? I don't care, because I'm not in love with what the world thinks. I'm in love with you. Kindle. I'm not leaving, Thatcher. Not because of a scandal, not because of reporters, not because some bitter rival wants to destroy what we have. I chose you when I thought you were a cold businessman with no heart. I'm choosing you now, knowing exactly who you are. She pressed her forehead to his. You want to know what real strength is? It's not protecting yourself from pain. It's choosing to be vulnerable anyway. It's letting someone see every broken, scared part of you and trusting they'll stay. What if you change your mind? His voice was barely a whisper. What if you wake up one day and decide I'm not worth it? What if I don't? What if 50 years from now we're still choosing each other? What if this scandal becomes just a story we tell about how we survived the hard times? She kissed him softly. Love isn't a feeling you fall into and hope it lasts, Thatcher. It's a choice you make again and again, in big moments and small ones. And I'm choosing you. Today, tomorrow, every day after, even when, especially when, it's hard. For a long moment, he just looked at her. She could see the war happening behind his eyes, the fear battling hope, the instinct to protect himself fighting against the desire to believe. Finally, he pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like she was the only thing keeping him upright. His face buried in her hair, and she felt his shoulders shake. I love you, he said, his voice muffled and broken, and more honest than she'd ever heard it. God help me. I love you so much it terrifies me. I know, Kindle whispered, holding him tighter. I love you too. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, while the world outside demanded their attention. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages piled up. The scandal continued to explode across every media platform. But inside the penthouse, two people were making a different choice. They were choosing each other, choosing vulnerability over safety, choosing to believe that some things were worth fighting for, even when the whole world said to walk away. When they finally pulled apart, Thatcher's eyes were red but clear. "We need to face this," he said. "Together." "Together," Kindle agreed. He took her hand, and they walked to the windows overlooking the city. Somewhere down there, reporters were sharpening their questions. Critics were preparing their judgments. The scandal was growing with every passing hour. But up here, 42 floors above the chaos, they had something the media couldn't touch: truth. Real, messy, complicated truth. Their marriage had started as a contract, but it had become so much more, and that was worth fighting for. This is the moment that defines everything. Will love survive the scandal? Will Thatcher's past destroy their future? Let me know in the comments what you think they should do. And if this story has you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this with someone who believes in real love. The press conference was scheduled for Friday afternoon, exactly 3 days after the scandal broke. Thatcher's team of publicists and lawyers had spent 72 hours crafting carefully worded statements designed to minimize damage and redirect the narrative. They'd prepared talking points, deflection strategies, and legal threats for media outlets that had published particularly invasive pieces. Thatcher threw all of it away. "We're telling the truth," he announced to his stunned communications director. "All of it." "That's professional suicide," the man protested. The public deserves honesty," Kindle interrupted, standing beside Thatcher. "We lied to them. Now we're going to tell them why, and what happened after." The director looked at Thatcher for confirmation. When he nodded, the man sighed heavily. "Your funeral," he muttered. "No," Thatcher said, taking Kindle's hand. "Our resurrection." The conference room was packed with reporters, cameras, and people who'd come hoping to witness the final fall of Thatcher Calloway. The air hummed with anticipation and barely concealed hostility. Kindle felt her palms sweating as they walked to the podium. Beside her, Thatcher's grip on her hand was firm, steady, an anchor in the storm. He stepped up to the microphone first, and the room fell silent. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice clear and controlled. "I'm sure you all have questions. Before I answer them, I need to tell you a story." He paused, and Kindle saw him take a breath, preparing himself to do something he'd never done before. Be vulnerable in front of strangers. 6 months ago, I was a man who'd built his entire life around control. I controlled my business, my emotions, my relationships. I did this because I watched my father destroy my family through weakness and poor choices, and I swore I'd never follow in his footsteps. His hand tightened on Kindle's. Then I met Kindle Mercer. She came to my office asking for help I had no intention of giving, but she didn't beg. She didn't manipulate. She proposed a business arrangement, something I understood, something I could control. He looked out at the sea of faces. Yes, our marriage began as a contract. Yes, I paid for her brother's medical treatment as part of that arrangement. Yes, we entered this relationship as a transaction designed to give my dying mother peace and give Kindle the resources to save her family. Murmurs ran through the crowd, but Thatcher continued. "Every single thing you've read about how we started is true. We signed papers. We agreed to terms. We promised to pretend for a specific period of time." He turned to look at Kindle, and his expression softened in a way that made even the most cynical reporters pause. "But somewhere between the contract and now, something neither of us planned happened. I fell in love with my wife." The murmurs grew louder, but Thatcher raised a hand. "Not because it was convenient, not because it looked good for my image, but because she showed me that the walls I'd built to protect myself were actually a prison. She showed me that being vulnerable isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing a person can do." He stepped back from the microphone, gesturing for Kindle to join him. She stepped forward, her heart racing but her voice steady. "I want to add something," she said. "I grew up poor. My grandmother raised me to value dignity over pride, to know my worth even when the world tried to tell me I had none. When my brother got sick, I was desperate. I would have done almost anything to save him." Her eyes swept the room. "So yes, I agreed to marry a man I barely knew for money. I'm not proud of that decision, but I'm not ashamed of it either. Love for my brother made me willing to do something unconventional. She glanced at Thatcher, and a small smile touched her lips. What I didn't expect was that pretending to love Thatcher would teach me what real love actually looks like. I didn't expect to discover a man who remembers small details, who fights his own nature to be kind, who carries the weight of caring for thousands of employees and never complains about it. She turned fully to face him now, speaking to him as much as to the reporters. We made an arrangement out of necessity. We found love because we chose to be honest with each other, even when honesty was terrifying. And if that makes us frauds, then every couple who started as strangers and became family is a fraud too. She looked back at the cameras. Judge us if you want, write your stories, speculate about our motives. But the truth is simple. I love this man. Contract or no contract, I will spend the rest of my life choosing him. Thatcher pulled her close, and when he kissed her, it wasn't for show. It was real and raw and completely unguarded. The cameras flashed. Questions erupted. But for that moment, they were the only two people in the room. When they finally faced the reporters' questions, they answered with complete honesty. Yes, the contract was real. Yes, money had changed hands. Yes, they'd deceived people initially. But they also talked about falling in love, about Genevieve's final wish, about how sometimes the most real things in life start with the most unlikely circumstances. The public response was mixed at first. Some called them manipulative, others called them romantic. Social media exploded with hot takes and think pieces. But slowly, gradually, the narrative began to shift. People started sharing their own stories of unconventional beginnings, of marriages that started for practical reasons but grew into genuine partnership, of love found in unexpected places. 3 weeks after the press conference, a poll showed that 68% of Americans believed Thatcher and Kendall's relationship was genuine. But by then, neither of them cared what the polls said. They had bigger concerns. Genevieve's health had deteriorated rapidly after the scandal broke. The stress, the doctors said, had accelerated her decline. Thatcher spent every available moment at her bedside, often with Kendall beside him. They read to her, told her stories, held her hand when the pain became too much. "I'm proud of you," Genevieve told Thatcher one afternoon, her voice weak but clear. "Not for the empire you built or the money you made. For choosing love even when it scared you." "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I almost pushed her away, but you didn't. That's what matters." She reached for Kendall's hand. "You kept your promise. You stayed. I always will," Kendall said, tears streaming down her face. Genevieve smiled. "I know, dear. That's why I can go peacefully. I know my boy won't be alone." She passed 3 days later, on a Sunday morning with spring sunlight streaming through the windows. Thatcher held her hand as she took her final breath, and Kendall held Thatcher as he wept. At the funeral, Thatcher spoke about his mother's strength, her grace, her unwavering belief that love was the only thing worth having in life. "She was right," he said, looking directly at Kendall in the front row. "About everything." The months following Genevieve's death were transformative. Thatcher and Kendall made the decision together. They were leaving the penthouse. It was beautiful, expensive, impressive, but it had never been a home. They found a brownstone in a neighborhood where kids played in the streets and neighbors actually knew each other's names. It needed work. The floors creaked, the plumbing was temperamental, and the kitchen was decades out of date. It was perfect. "Are you sure about this?" the realtor asked, clearly confused why a billionaire would choose this property over the luxury options she'd shown them. "Completely," Kendall said, already envisioning where furniture would go. They spent weekends renovating, doing much of the work themselves. Thatcher, who'd never held a paintbrush in his life, learned how to repaint walls. Kendall, who'd never had the luxury of designing a space, threw herself into making every room meaningful. Micah came to visit once the house was livable. The months since the scandal had been difficult between them, but slowly, painfully, they'd rebuilt their relationship. "I'm sorry I doubted you," he said, standing in the kitchen that Kindle had painted a warm yellow. "I'm sorry I lied to you," she replied. They hugged, and something that had been broken between them finally healed. Thatcher expanded the Callaway Foundation, renaming it in his mother's honor. They focused on medical debt relief, helping families facing the same impossible choices Kindle had faced. Kindle went back to teaching, but also started writing. Her first book, a middle-grade novel about a girl who learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, sold to a publisher within 3 months. On their first anniversary, they renewed their vows. This time, there was no contract, no prenuptial agreement, no end date. Just 2 people promising to choose each other every single day for the rest of their lives. "I meant what I said in the garden that night," Thatcher told her as they danced at their small reception. "I did ruin you for other men." Kindle laughed. "You're right. No one else could ever compare." "Good," he said, pulling her closer. "That was the plan. Before we reach the beautiful conclusion of this incredible journey, I want you to take a moment to reflect on your own relationships. Are you choosing love daily? Hit subscribe if stories like this inspire you to be braver in love, and comment below about a time when love required you to be truly vulnerable. A year later, Kindle stood in the nursery they'd prepared, rocking their daughter Noelle while humming softly. The baby had her father's grey eyes and her mother's dark curls, and she was absolutely perfect. Thatcher appeared in the doorway, watching them with an expression of such complete contentment that it made Kindle's heart swell. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around them both. "I'm thinking about how I almost let fear win. How I almost pushed you away because I was too scared to believe I deserved this." He kissed the top of Noelle's head, then Kindle's forehead. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you were braver than I was, that you stayed when I gave you every reason to leave." "Always," Kindle whispered. "I'll always stay." And she did. Through challenges and triumphs, through ordinary days and extraordinary moments, through everything life threw at them, they stayed. They chose each other, every single day. 3 years after a desperate woman walked into a billionaire's office with nothing but borrowed courage and a brother to save, Kindle Callaway stood on a stage in the heart of the neighborhood she'd grown up in, the Beatrice Mercer Community Center, named after the grandmother who taught her. The difference between pride and dignity gleamed with fresh paint and possibility. The building had once been an abandoned warehouse, a monument to urban decay and forgotten dreams. Now it housed after-school programs, job training workshops, a medical clinic, and a library filled with books donated by people who believed in second chances. The crowd gathered for the opening was a mixture of everything Kindle's life had become. Her, former students and their families, neighbors who remembered her grandmother, business, associates from Thatcher's world who'd become genuine friends, and reporters who'd come to witness the full circle moment. In the front row sat Micah, fully recovered and thriving in his 2nd year of medical school. Beside him, Thatcher held 18-month-old Noelle, who was trying to grab everything within reach with her chubby hands. When the toddler squealed with delight, Thatcher's expression of patient amusement made several people in the audience smile. This was not the cold businessman the tabloids had once written about. This was a father, a husband, a man transformed by the choice to let someone in. Kindle gripped the microphone, overwhelmed by the moment. 3 years ago, she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. I stood in an office 42 floors above this city, desperate and afraid. I had no money, no options, and a brother whose life depended on me finding a solution I couldn't afford. She paused, finding Thatcher's eyes in the crowd. I walked into that office prepared to negotiate. What I didn't know was that I was about to meet the person who would teach me that the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be truly known. Noelle babbled something, and the audience laughed softly. Thatcher kissed his daughter's head, his attention never leaving his wife. People always ask me how we went from a business arrangement to a real marriage. They want to know the secret, the moment everything changed, the key to making love last. Kindle smiled, remembering a garden conversation and a warning that had turned into a promise. The truth is, there's no secret. We just chose each other. Every day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Love isn't a feeling you fall into and hope it lasts. It's a choice you make again and again, in big moments and small ones. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. My husband once told me he would ruin me for other men. At the time, I thought it was arrogance. She laughed softly. Now I understand what he meant. He didn't mean he would possess me or control me. He meant he would love me so completely that I would never wonder what I was worth again. She looked directly at Thatcher, speaking to him as much as to the audience. And he has. Every single day he has shown me that I am worth choosing, worth fighting for, worth staying for, even when staying is difficult. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. This building represents that same principle. Every person who walks through these doors is worth investing in, worth believing in, worth choosing even when it's easier to look away. She gestured to the center behind her. We built this place because my grandmother taught me that dignity is free, but sometimes people need help accessing it. Because Thatcher's mother believed that love, real, active, daily love, is the only thing worth leaving behind. Because my brother survived, and now he's going to spend his life saving others. Her voice softened. And because two people made an arrangement they thought was temporary and discovered something permanent. We found love not despite our circumstances, but through them. The applause was thunderous. But Kindle barely heard it. She was watching Thatcher stand, shift Noel to one hip, and make his way through the crowd toward the stage. When he reached her, he handed their daughter to Micah and pulled Kindle into his arms. "I love you," he said, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Today, tomorrow, every day, after, I love you too," she whispered back. That evening, after the celebration ended, and Noel was tucked into bed, Thatcher and Kindle stood on the balcony of their brownstone. The city stretched before them, alive with light and possibility. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if I hadn't ignored your letters for 3 months?" Thatcher asked, pulling her back against his chest. "Every day," Kindle admitted. "But I don't regret the waiting, or the struggle, or even the scandal. All of it brought us here." She turned in his arms to face him. "You know what the best part is?" "What?" "We're just getting started." He kissed her then, not with the desperation of their first kiss or the passion of their second, but with the certainty of a man who knew he had found home. And in that moment, they both understood the deepest truth of their story. Love doesn't conquer all because it's powerful. Love conquers all because it makes us brave enough to be truly known, and to stay anyway. It transforms us not by erasing our flaws, but by giving us someone who sees every broken, scared, imperfect part of us and chooses us regardless. That was the lesson Kindle's grandmother had tried to teach her all those years ago. That was the gift Genevieve had given her son by insisting he open his heart one last time. That was the truth they would pass on to Noel and to every person who walked through the doors of the community center bearing her great-grandmother's name. Love is a choice, the most important choice, the bravest choice, and it's worth choosing every single day. And that, my friends, is the truth about love that changes everything. It's not about finding someone perfect. It's about choosing someone daily and becoming brave enough to be perfectly imperfect together. If this story moved you, show some love by hitting that subscribe button, ringing the notification bell, and sharing this with someone who needs to remember that real love is always worth fighting for. Until next time, this is Mr. Roman reminding you that the best stories are the ones that teach us how to live.